Okay, did I go anywhere? Did I go anywhere? This is the unlawful detainment, so it's gonna be great. This is gonna be awesome right here. You're a idiot. Yeah, it's an unlawful detainment. Get him out here. That was so dumb.
The night had been quiet until the streetlights flickered over an empty Long Beach Avenue, interrupted only by the low hum of distant traffic and the muted chatter of officers huddled around their vehicles. The routine, almost imperceptible rhythm of the evening was shattered when one man, carrying nothing more than a camera, approached the scene. His steps were deliberate, unhurried, yet purposeful. It was a simple act, a man seeking answers, but the reaction it provoked was anything but simple. From the moment the officer first noticed the camera, the tone shifted, eyes narrowed, posture stiffened, commands became sharper. This was no longer a routine stop. It had transformed into a standoff, a confrontation with authority itself. Gambino, the man recording, was unarmed. His questions were measured, calm, grounded in civility. Yet each inquiry seemed to escalate the tension further. Authority, once procedural and predictable, had become reactive and personal. The street itself told the story. It was blocked by police cruisers, a controlled environment. There was no traffic to impede, no threat visible beyond the camera lens. Yet the officer insisted there was obstruction, as if the law could be reshaped in the heat of a moment to justify control. Words like detained and arrest were thrown into the air, heavy with implied power. The man recording was suddenly no longer a citizen but a subject of authority, caught in the machinery of enforcement that cared little for context. Each exchange revealed more than just conflict, it revealed priorities. The officer, unflinching, refused to answer simple questions about identity. He repeated commands and threats, asserting dominance over procedure. Gambino remained composed, aware of his rights, demanding accountability. The power imbalance was stark. One held authority backed by law, training, and the shield of qualified immunity. The other held only a camera, a question, and the courage to speak. Silence became a weapon. The pauses between words, the refusal to engage, the deliberate avoidance of accountability, all were tools to unsettle. Gambino's insistence on recording and asking for a supervisor challenged that control. Each repeated command to call your supervisor underscored the officer's insistence on hierarchy, on unquestioned obedience. The street, once neutral, had become a stage where authority could be tested and in subtle ways resisted. Qualified immunity hovered over the encounter like a shadow. Intended as protection for officers acting in good faith, it became a shield that allowed escalation without immediate consequence. Each raised voice, each demand for compliance, each unlawful detainment was softened by the knowledge that legal repercussions were distant, complicated, unlikely. This protection, however, does not erase the human cost, the immediate tension, the quiet sense of threat imposed on someone asserting their rights. By the time the encounter reached its peak, Gambino had been detained, his voice temporarily silenced, his camera interrupted. Yet in that silence lay its own commentary. What does it mean when the mere act of questioning authority is enough to justify detainment? What is revealed when the tools of enforcement can be applied selectively, arbitrarily, and without immediate accountability? The streetlights, the parked cruisers, the blocked road, all served as witnesses to an unbalanced dynamic where procedure and personal reaction collided. Through the lens of the camera, small gestures became monumental. The subtle tightening of a jaw, the step forward to assert dominance, the pointed repetition of "call your supervisor," each carried weight. In these details, the narrative of power unfolds. The encounter was not violent in the traditional sense, but it was coercive, controlling, irreversible in its demonstration of authority. Every second that passed without de-escalation compounded the stakes. What began as a routine question escalated into a confrontation, illustrating broader patterns. This was a microcosm of the tension between citizen oversight and unchecked authority. Gambino's persistence exposed a system that, under the protection of legal shields, could push boundaries with minimal immediate consequence. It was a moment where the abstract concept of rights collided with the tangible exercise of power. Even as the conversation dragged on, with repeated refusals to acknowledge requests, the potential for escalation lingered. The body language, the verbal insistence, the repeated threats all signaled that the encounter could have taken a darker turn at any moment. Here, in the quiet night under the flickering streetlights, authority was being wielded not as a measure of safety, but as a tool to dominate and silence. This was the first irreversible point. The officer chose escalation over reason. The dynamic had shifted, and Gambino's position, though legally justified, was made precarious. There was no going back to routine. The street, the vehicles, the silence, and the camera had witnessed the transformation of authority from procedural to personal. The escalation was methodical. Each demand, each repetition served to reinforce the officer's control. Gambino's calm responses, however, maintained pressure on the system. He asked questions that could not be ignored without exposing the abuse inherent in the encounter. "What's your name and badge number?" he asked. It was a simple, factual request, yet it triggered a cascade of defensive posturing. Every denial, every insistence that the citizen was obstructing traffic, painted a portrait of authority, prioritizing control over reason. The mechanics of escalation were clear. The officer's body leaned forward, gestures clipped, voice rising just enough to assert dominance but restrained enough to avoid outright violence. This was a choreography of intimidation, precise and measured. Meanwhile, Gambino stood firm, his camera serving as both shield and witness. Each frame captured the subtle shifts, the tightening of hands on the steering wheel, the tilt of the head, the pause before issuing a command. These were not idle moments, they were evidence of tension crystallized. The street itself, blocked and empty, became a paradoxical symbol. There was no danger, no obstruction, yet the officer continued to assert threat, citing traffic violations when none existed. This demonstrates a critical facet of real-world escalation. The perception of authority can be manipulated independent of circumstance. Enforcement, when divorced from context, becomes an assertion of power for its own sake. The tension is not in the law, but in its application or misapplication. Qualified immunity loomed as a silent guarantor of impunity. While intended to protect officers acting in good faith, in this moment it functioned differently. It became a shield that enabled assertive misapplication of power without immediate consequence. The officer's insistence on detaining Gambino, the refusal to provide meaningful answers, the repeated commands, were all conducted with this protective layer in mind. The human impact, the erosion of trust, the implicit threat, these were immediate, tangible, and irreversible. Small actions carried immense weight, a hand raised to demand compliance, a phone confiscated to silence testimony. A single step into the street transformed from innocuous movement to justification for detainment. Each minute compounded the effect. For the observer, it is the accumulation of these details that creates a sense of discomfort, a tension that feels inevitable. Yet Gambino's composure prevented the situation from descending into outright chaos. His insistence on recording, his repeated requests for a supervisor, his measured speech, all created a counterbalance to authority exercised without accountability. He transformed passive resistance into a powerful assertion of rights. This was not dramatic spectacle, it was disciplined persistence under pressure, a study in how one individual can test the limits of a system designed to protect its own. The standoff became a lens into broader systemic questions. When does protection become cover? When does lawful immunity become a mechanism to suppress scrutiny? The encounter is illustrative, a distilled example of how quickly routine oversight can become personal confrontation, and how legal protections intended to safeguard can also shield misuse. Tension continued to mount as Gambino refused to comply with demands he recognized as unlawful. The officer's body language grew more insistent, each phrase more clipped, each threat subtly intensified. Silence again became a tool. The officer's unwillingness to justify actions left Gambino navigating a space defined by coercion rather than law. Here, escalation is measured not by violence but by constraint, the removal of options, the narrowing of safe responses, the implicit warning of consequence. When the phone was temporarily confiscated, the stakes crystallized. Control had shifted. The act of recording, of speaking, had provoked a demonstration of authority calibrated to silence. The scene under the streetlights, flanked by police vehicles, underscored the fragility of individual agency when confronted with institutional power reinforced by legal shields. Every repetition of "call your supervisor" served as a drumbeat. The officer's insistence on hierarchy contrasted with the citizen's insistence on rights. Each verbal echo intensified the tension. The encounter was no longer about a single question or street interaction. It became a microcosm of the conflict between power and accountability. between procedural authority and the exercise of individual rights. By the time the sergeant arrived, the pattern was established. Escalation had occurred, rights had been challenged. Authority had been exercised selectively, and the encounter was now irreversibly defined by these actions. Gambino had not lost, but the street had borne witness to the imbalance, the coercion, and the structural safeguards that allowed it. The arrival of the sergeant did little to reverse the dynamics already in motion. The street remained a controlled theater, officers positioned with calculated posture, the citizen at its center holding a camera that captured each moment. The escalation had passed a point of return, authority had been asserted, rights challenged, and the framework of protection had been exposed as both safeguard and shield for misuse. Gambino's persistence highlighted the inherent tension between citizens and those empowered to enforce the law. Each question posed was a probe into the limits of authority. Each demand for accountability a challenge to the implicit assumption that power could be exercised without scrutiny. The officer's defensiveness, the repeated commands, the selective enforcement, all revealed how quickly lawful authority can become personal, how easily procedure can be overshadowed by ego and insecurity. The confiscation of the phone marked the peak of control. Silencing the citizen was a physical manifestation of power, turning rights into privilege contingent on compliance. Yet the moment also exposed vulnerability. The officer relied on legal shields, procedural ambiguity, and hierarchical leverage to enforce control. These mechanisms are invisible to most observers but starkly apparent to those at the center. Here the bodycam was not just witness, it was evidence, leverage, and counterweight. Throughout the encounter, silence and repetition worked together to shape the narrative. The pauses, the insistence on supervisor contact, the refusal to engage meaningfully, all reinforced the authority's dominance. Tension was not explosive but pervasive, a slow tightening that left no easy escape. For anyone observing, the discomfort was palpable. The outcome, once escalation had begun, felt inevitable. This episode serves as a vivid demonstration of how procedural authority, unchecked by immediate accountability, can create coercive environments. Qualified immunity provided the legal cover, but the human cost was immediate. The stress, the intimidation, the interruption of a peaceful interaction. These consequences are often invisible, yet they are the ones that define the lived experience of rights and power. The encounter also underscores the role of vigilance. Gambino's camera, his persistence, and his knowledge of rights transformed a potentially suppressive interaction into a documented challenge. This is a reminder that oversight is not just procedural, it is participatory. Rights exist in practice only when exercised, defended, and observed. As the sergeant took control, the tension shifted subtly. Authority was maintained, but escalation ceased. The citizen remained, camera in hand, asserting presence, recording evidence, demanding accountability. It was a resolution of sorts, but not a reset. The street, the vehicles, and the recorded dialogue had already borne witness to the imbalance. The episode would ripple further through lawsuits, discussion, and scrutiny of qualified immunity itself. In the quiet aftermath, the power dynamics were clear. Authority had been asserted, rights had been challenged, silence and procedural leverage had been wielded as tools. The moment revealed not just the behavior of one officer, but the structure that allows such behavior to occur. It exposed the collision between individual courage and institutional power. Gambino's persistence, the calm yet deliberate assertion of rights, and the recorded evidence left the encounter unresolved legally, but resolved morally. The citizen had stood against unchecked authority, exposing vulnerabilities in a system designed to protect those in power. The final lesson is stark. Control can be asserted instantly, but accountability requires persistence and vigilance and the courage to ask questions that some would rather remain unanswered. By the time the street returned to its quiet rhythm, the moment was etched into memory, a reminder that authority without oversight can escalate rapidly, and that a single camera, a single voice, can illuminate the structures that allow power to go unchecked. The encounter ended, but its implications persisted, silent, uncomfortable, and irreversible.